You can tell a lot about a hunter by what he leaves behind. The wind moved slowly through the alien forest, carrying the cool scent of wet leaves and distant rain across miles of towering blue-trunk trees that stretched nearly 200 feet into the misty sky. High above the ground, balanced silently on a narrow ridge of black stone, the alien huntress Caritha studied the clearing below with patient, calculating eyes. She had arrived expecting to track a dangerous predator rumored to roam this valley, a creature large enough to leave deep impressions in the moss and strong enough to bend young trees as it passed. Instead, what she found confused her. The clearing was quiet. Too quiet. 10 enormous shapes lay scattered across the grass like fallen statues, their armored bodies still beneath the dim silver sunlight of this world's distant star. Caritha crouched lower, her blue skin blending into the shadow of the rocks as she examined the scene through the enhanced lenses of her visor. The creatures had not been chased across the forest or driven into traps by a pack of hunters. No, the tracks told a different story. Each animal had approached the clearing from a different direction. Each had stopped at nearly the same distance, and each had fallen in almost the exact same place. Her gaze shifted to the center of the clearing, where a single figure moved quietly among the tall grass. A human, male, medium height by Volari standards, perhaps 6 feet tall by Earth measurement, with broad shoulders and a steady posture that suggested long years spent outdoors rather than in cities or starships. He wore a faded field jacket and carried a bow across his back instead of the advanced plasma rifles most interstellar hunters preferred. Caritha narrowed her eyes slightly. Humans were not known as apex predators in the galactic records. Their species was categorized as adaptable, creative, and emotionally unpredictable, but physically inferior to dozens of warrior races. Yet the evidence in the clearing refused to match that assumption. The human moved calmly from one fallen creature to another, kneeling occasionally to inspect the ground, adjusting a strap on his gear, or quietly retrieving arrows embedded with careful precision. There was no celebration in his movements, no pride, only efficiency. The wind shifted again, and the man paused instantly, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something too faint for ordinary ears to detect. Caritha remained perfectly still on the ridge nearly 300 yards away, confident her cloaking weave and elevation kept her invisible. The human slowly lifted his gaze toward the distant rocks where she hid. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then the man spoke in a calm, steady voice that somehow carried through the quiet valley. "You've been watching for a while," he said, not raising his voice, not reaching for a weapon. "Might as well come out now." And for the first time since arriving on this planet, Caritha felt something rare stir inside her disciplined hunter's mind. Surprise. Caritha did not move at first. The wind brushed across the ridge again, cool and steady, carrying the quiet sounds of the valley below. The human still stood in the clearing nearly 300 yards away, one hand resting loosely near the strap of his gear, his posture relaxed in a way that made no sense to her trained instincts. Most beings would have reached for a weapon the moment they sensed an unseen observer. This man simply waited. Slowly, Caritha rose from her crouched position. Her movement was silent, controlled, the result of decades of Volari hunt training. The cloaking weave around her armor faded with a faint shimmer as she stepped out from the shadows of the rocks. Sunlight touched her blue skin and silver hunting armor as she descended the narrow slope toward the clearing below. The ground was soft with moss, absorbing the sound of her footsteps. When she reached the edge of the clearing, the human had not moved an inch. He watched her approach with calm curiosity, his eyes steady and alert but not hostile. Up close she could see more details. His hair was dark and wind pushed loose strands across his forehead. His clothing was worn but well maintained, the fabric carrying small repairs that suggested long use in the wilderness. A bow rested across his back, simple in design but crafted with careful precision. Caritha stopped roughly 20 feet away. For several seconds neither of them spoke. She studied him the same way she would study any unknown creature in the wild. His breathing was slow, his stance balanced. No scent of fear reached her enhanced senses. That alone was unusual. Finally she tilted her head slightly. "Most humans do not notice a Volari huntress watching them," she said, her voice calm and measured. The human shrugged lightly. "Most humans probably do not spend their lives out here. His voice carried the steady tone of someone used to long silence and wide spaces. Caritha glanced briefly toward the scattered creatures across the clearing. Did you hunt all of these alone? The human followed her gaze and nodded once. Took most of the morning. He said it the same way someone might mention repairing a fence. No pride. No exaggeration. Caritha walked slowly toward one of the fallen animals and crouched beside it. Her gloved fingers traced the clean mark left behind by a single arrow strike. Precise. Controlled. Efficient. The creature had stopped almost exactly where the others had. She stood again and looked back at the human. Your species is not known for this level of hunting skill. The human smiled faintly. Your species probably reads a lot of outdated reports. For the first time, a hint of amusement touched Caritha's expression. She circled the clearing once more, studying the wind direction, the tracks, the careful spacing between each animal. Nothing here was random. Everything showed planning and patience. Finally, she returned to stand in front of him. Tell me something, human, she said quietly. Did you know I was following you before today? The man reached up and casually adjusted the strap of his bow. Then he looked directly into her bright alien eyes. About 2 days ago, he replied. You move well, just not well enough. For the second time since meeting him, Caritha felt genuine surprise. And for a Valari huntress, surprise was the beginning of respect. Caritha remained silent for several seconds after the human spoke. 2 days. He had known for 2 full planetary rotations that a Valari huntress was tracking him through the forest, and yet he had continued his routine as if nothing unusual had happened. That alone was remarkable. Most beings would have reacted with fear, or at the very least caution. Ethan Walker had simply continued hunting. The wind shifted again across the clearing, gently moving the tall grass around their feet. The human glanced briefly toward the distant tree line as if measuring the weather. Then he knelt beside one of the fallen creatures and began carefully removing the arrow lodged in the ground nearby. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost respectful. Caritha watched closely. Valari hunters were trained to harvest trophies from their kills, proof of skill and dominance. Yet Ethan did not behave that way. Instead, he checked the condition of the arrow shaft, wiped the metal tip clean with a cloth from his pocket, and placed it carefully back into the quiver on his back. You are not concerned that I might attack you, Caritha said. The human stood again and shrugged slightly. If you wanted to do that, you would have tried already. He spoke with the simple confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. Caritha studied his face, searching for arrogance or mockery, but she found neither. His calm seemed genuine. You are very certain of yourself, she said. Ethan shook his head. Not really. Just paying attention. He gestured lightly toward the surrounding forest. Out here, attention keeps you alive. Caritha looked across the clearing once more. The pattern of the hunt became clearer the longer she observed it. Each creature had approached from a direction where the wind carried the humans scent away from them. Each path funneled naturally toward the same open ground. The placement of fallen branches and disturbed grass suggested that Ethan had guided the animals without them realizing it. It was not just hunting skill. It was planning. You shaped the environment, she said slowly. You allowed the forest itself to become part of the hunt. Ethan smiled faintly at that. The forest was here first. I just listened to it. Caritha felt something unfamiliar stir in her thoughts. Among the Valari, hunting was a test of strength and speed. Victory belonged to the warrior who dominated the prey. But what she had witnessed here was different. This human did not dominate the forest. He worked with it. She stepped closer, her tall frame casting a long shadow beside him in the silver sunlight. There is a creature that roams deeper in this region, she said. Larger than the animals you hunted today. Faster. Far more difficult to track. Ethan lifted an eyebrow slightly. Sounds like you are describing a challenge. Caritha's eyes gleamed faintly. In my culture, hunters prove themselves by facing such challenges. Ethan adjusted the strap of his quiver and looked toward the distant mountains that rose beyond the forest canopy. For a moment he said nothing. Then he nodded once. All right, he said calmly. Show me. Caritha studied him carefully as the wind moved through the valley again. Most hunters would have demanded details or payment before accepting such an offer. This human simply agreed, as if curiosity mattered more than caution. In that moment, Caritha began to realize something important. The stories about human hunters had not been exaggerations. If anything, they had been incomplete. The sun had climbed higher by the time they left the clearing behind. Silver light filtered through the towering forest canopy nearly 200 feet above them, turning the drifting morning mist into thin ribbons of glowing air. Caritha moved ahead along a narrow ridge path with the effortless balance of a trained huntress, her steps light and precise despite the uneven stone beneath her boots. Behind her, Ethan Walker followed at a steady pace, neither rushing nor lagging, his eyes quietly observing the shifting landscape around them. The forest here felt older. The trees grew thicker, their deep blue trunks twisting toward the sky like ancient pillars. Strange birds called from somewhere high above, their long echoing notes rolling through the valley like distant wind chimes. After nearly half an hour of silent walking, Ethan finally spoke. "You said this creature lives deeper in the region," he said calmly. "How deep are we talking?" Caritha did not turn around as she answered. "Another 5 miles east. The terrain becomes rougher beyond the river basin." Ethan nodded slightly, adjusting the strap of his bow. "So this is not a normal hunt." Caritha allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "No, it is not." They continued forward until the forest suddenly opened onto a wide overlook. Below them stretched a massive basin of dark green vegetation nearly 2 miles across. A narrow river cut through the valley like a silver ribbon, winding between scattered clusters of massive stone formations that looked almost like broken towers. Ethan stepped beside her and studied the view in silence. The wind moved slowly across the basin, carrying the cool scent of water and distant rain. "Something big lives down there," he said after a moment. Caritha glanced at him. "You can tell already." Ethan nodded toward the riverbank far below. "Look at the tree line along the water." Caritha followed his gaze. Several of the massive trees near the river leaned slightly outward, their branches bent in the same direction. Ethan crouched and picked up a small stone, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. "Large animals push through forests in straight paths," he explained. "Smaller ones move around obstacles. Whatever lies here does not move around anything." Caritha felt the quiet satisfaction of confirmation. The human was reading the environment exactly as she had hoped. "My people call it the apex walker," she said softly. "It has lived in this basin for decades. Many Valari hunters have attempted to track it." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Attempted?" Caritha nodded once. "None have succeeded." Ethan stood again, scanning the basin below with calm focus. The valley stretched nearly 1.5 miles from ridge to river, a landscape of shadows and drifting wind patterns that shifted constantly across the tall vegetation. "You are testing me," he said finally. Caritha did not deny it. "Yes." Ethan seemed to consider that for a moment. Then he looked back at the distant river. "Fair enough." The simplicity of his response caught her slightly off guard. "You do not object?" she asked. Ethan shrugged lightly. "Every hunter gets curious eventually." The wind rose again, rustling through the forest behind them like a long, slow breath. Caritha watched the human beside her, studying the relaxed posture, the quiet awareness in his eyes, the absence of fear even while facing a challenge that had defeated some of the finest warriors in her species. For the third time since meeting him, she felt the strange sense that the galactic records about humans had overlooked something important. Something subtle. Something dangerous in a very different way. The descent into the basin took nearly an hour. The ridge trail narrowed as it dropped toward the valley floor, forcing them to move carefully between clusters of ancient stone and twisted roots that had pushed through the soil over centuries. The air grew cooler as they approached the river basin, and the forest sounds gradually changed. The higher branches still carried the distant calls of birds, but down here another layer of sound existed beneath it. Low rustling movements. The subtle shifting of heavy vegetation. Ethan slowed his pace slightly and lifted one hand, signaling a pause. Caritha stopped instantly behind him. She noticed the change before he even spoke. His shoulders had lowered. His breathing had become slower, more deliberate. He was listening to the land. After several seconds he crouched near a patch of flattened grass and brushed his fingers lightly across the ground. The plants here bent in a wide arc, not broken but pressed down repeatedly by something large passing through. Ethan studied the direction of the bend and glanced toward the river nearly 1/2 mile away. "It uses the water as a travel line," he said quietly. Caritha folded her arms. "Yes. Most hunters believe it remains near the river because prey gathers there. Ethan shook his head slowly. Not just prey. He pointed toward the distant waterline. Sound carries differently across open water. If something moves in the forest, the river tells you before the trees do. Caritha felt a quiet flicker of interest at that observation. Valari hunters relied heavily on technology and physical tracking. Very few studied the acoustic behavior of terrain. Ethan stood again and walked a few steps forward before stopping beside a tall rock formation that overlooked the valley floor. He rested one hand against the stone and examined the faint scratches across its surface. Something passes through here regularly, he said. Same route. Same timing. Caritha stepped beside him and looked at the marks. To her enhanced vision, they were nearly invisible, faint lines against the dark mineral surface. You see patterns quickly, she said. Ethan smiled faintly. Patterns keep hunters alive. The wind shifted again, rolling slowly across the basin. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, as if measuring the air itself. When he opened them, he turned slightly toward the deeper section of the valley where the vegetation grew thicker and darker. Your apex walker, he said quietly. It is not just large. Caritha tilted her head. What do you mean? Ethan pointed toward the distant treeline again. Look at the spacing between those trees. About 40 feet apart. Big enough for something tall to move through without slowing down. Caritha felt a faint spark of approval. Correct. Ethan rested his hand on the bough across his back and studied the valley once more. But that is not the interesting part. Caritha watched him carefully. Then what is? Ethan's eyes followed a narrow line of crushed plants that disappeared toward the riverbank. It knows this valley better than any hunter who has come here. Caritha raised an eyebrow. All predators know their territory. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes, but this one also knows when it is being watched. The words lingered in the quiet air between them. Caritha felt something unexpected stir in her thoughts again. For the first time since they had begun the descent into the basin, she realized the human might not be walking into a hunt at all. He might be walking into a contest between two creatures that understood the same rules. The basin grew quieter the deeper they walked. The tall vegetation rose above Ethan's shoulders now, long silver-green blades bending slowly under the afternoon wind. The river lay somewhere ahead, hidden behind layers of dense foliage, but its presence could be heard in the faint rushing sound carried across the valley floor. Ethan slowed again and crouched near the ground, brushing his hand lightly over a wide patch of soil where the plants had been pressed flat. The impression stretched nearly 15 feet across, far wider than any of the creatures he had hunted earlier that morning. Caritha watched him carefully. The human did not speak for several seconds. He simply studied the pattern, the angle of the bent stems, the small fragments of bark scattered across the dirt. Finally, he stood and looked toward the distant riverbank. It passed here recently, he said quietly. Caritha nodded once. Within the last hour. Ethan glanced at her with mild curiosity. You can tell that precisely. Caritha gestured toward the flattened grass. The plant fibers have not yet recovered their natural tension. On this world, they begin straightening after approximately 70 minutes. Ethan gave a small approving nod. Good observation. They continued walking slowly through the valley until the vegetation opened into a wide strip of pale sand beside the river. The water moved steadily between dark stone banks, reflecting the muted sky like polished metal. The far side of the basin rose into a wall of forest nearly a mile wide. Ethan stepped onto the sand and studied the shoreline carefully. Several enormous tracks crossed the riverbank in a straight line, each impression deep and widely spaced. The distance between them suggested a stride far longer than any animal native to Earth. He crouched beside one of the marks and measured the length with his forearm. Nearly 4 feet. Caritha stood behind him with quiet patience. Now you see why Valari hunters consider it a worthy challenge, she said. Ethan remained crouched for another moment, tracing the edge of the track with one finger. The sand crumbled slightly under his touch. It moves confidently, he said. No hesitation in the step pattern. Caritha folded her arms. It fears nothing in this basin. Ethan stood again and scanned the treeline across the river. The wind moved through the branches in slow waves, bending the upper canopy like a shifting ocean. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he pointed toward a narrow break in the trees nearly 300 yards away. That is where it will appear next, he said calmly. Caritha followed his gaze. You sound certain. Ethan nodded once. Because it is already watching us. The words settled into the quiet air beside the river. Caritha's eyes sharpened slightly. She activated the enhanced lenses in her visor and scanned the distant tree carefully. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then the shadows shifted. High between two massive trunks, something enormous moved slowly behind the curtain of leaves. Not attacking, not retreating, simply observing the two hunters standing beside the river. Ethan rested one hand lightly on the grip of his bow, but made no move to raise it. Instead, he watched the dark shape with the calm focus of someone greeting an equal. "There you are," he said softly into the wind. Caritha realized then that this hunt had already begun long before they reached the basin. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Ethan remained standing at the edge of the riverbank, the cool water moving quietly behind him, while the massive tree across the basin stood still beneath the pale afternoon sky. Caritha watched through her visor as the shadow between the trees shifted again, enormous and deliberate. The apex walker did not rush forward like a mindless predator. It simply stepped closer to the edge of the forest where the light could reach it. For the first time, Caritha saw its full outline. The creature stood easily 15 feet tall at the shoulder, its long frame supported by powerful limbs that moved with slow, confident precision. Thick plates of natural armor ran along its back like overlapping stone, catching the sunlight in dull gray reflections. It did not look angry. It looked aware. Ethan studied the giant shape for several seconds without reaching for his bow. The wind rolled softly across the basin, carrying the scent of river water and distant rain. "Smart," he said quietly. Caritha glanced at him. "You recognize the behavior." Ethan nodded once. "It is studying us the same way we study it." The apex walker stepped out from the forest line, placing one massive foot onto the pale sand across the river. Even at that distance, its size was unmistakable. The creature's head lifted slightly as it observed the two figures on the opposite bank. Caritha felt the instinctive tension of a Valari hunter preparing for a decisive moment, but Ethan remained calm beside her. His eyes moved across the valley slowly, measuring distance, wind direction, and terrain. "If you fire now, you might reach it," Caritha said. Ethan shook his head immediately. "Too far. And it knows that." The giant creature lowered its head toward the river, not to drink, but to study the current flowing between the two banks. The moment felt strangely quiet, like two rival hunters acknowledging each other across a field. Ethan crouched briefly and scooped a handful of sand from the ground, letting the grains fall slowly through his fingers. The breeze carried them toward the west. He stood again and stepped slightly to the left where a cluster of smooth rocks rose near the shoreline. Caritha watched him carefully. "You are repositioning." Ethan nodded. "It is testing us, seeing how we respond." Across the river, the apex walker began walking along the opposite bank, not approaching directly, but circling through the open terrain. Its long stride carried it through the valley grass with quiet confidence. Caritha followed its movement through her visor. "It is avoiding a straight path." Ethan smiled faintly. "Exactly." Caritha glanced back at him. "You expected that." Ethan rested one hand on the grip of his bow. Any creature that survives this long learns to avoid predictable patterns. The apex walker stopped again roughly 400 yards downriver and turned its massive head toward them once more. For a long moment, the three figures remained frozen across the wide valley space. Two hunters on one bank, one ancient creature on the other. Caritha felt the strange tension of a hunt that had not yet begun but was already being decided through patience alone. Then Ethan spoke softly, almost to himself. "Good," he said. Caritha looked at him with curiosity. "Good." Ethan's eyes never left the giant silhouette across the river. "Because if it were stupid," he continued calmly, "this would not be interesting." The river continued to flow between them like a quiet boundary drawn by the valley itself. Ethan stood beside the smooth rocks at the edge of the water, his eyes following the massive figure of the apex walker as it moved along the opposite bank. The creature had not left. It had not charged or retreated. Instead, it remained within sight, circling slowly through the open terrain with the calm patience of something that understood the rhythm of this land far better than any visitor. Caritha lowered the magnification of her visor and studied Ethan instead. The human hunter had not reached for an arrow. He had not shifted into an aggressive stance. He simply watched, the same way the creature watched them. The wind rolled across the basin again, stronger now, bending the tall grass in slow waves that moved from the river toward the distant forest. Ethan noticed the change immediately. He lifted his head slightly, feeling the direction of the breeze against his face. Then he crouched and drew a simple line in the sand with the tip of one finger. Karitha stepped closer and looked down. He had sketched the shape of the valley basin. The river curved through the center, and the treeline stood like a dark wall at the far edge. Ethan added 2 small marks on opposite sides of the river. One represented them. The other represented the creature. "It is not trying to ambush us," he said quietly. Karitha nodded. "It does not need to." Ethan erased part of the line with the side of his hand and redrew it slightly farther downstream. "No," he said calmly. "It is doing something else." Karitha tilted her head. "Explain." Ethan pointed toward the far treeline where the apex walker had paused once again. "It is guiding us." The statement lingered in the air. Karitha studied the basin carefully through her visor once more. The creature had indeed shifted its path several times, always keeping a steady distance while moving gradually along the riverbank. Not fleeing, not advancing, redirecting. Ethan stood again and looked toward the same direction. "If we keep following the river, we will eventually reach the narrow bend in the valley." Karitha recognized the location immediately. The river passed through a tight stone corridor nearly half a mile downstream, where the basin narrowed between 2 enormous cliffs. "The Echo Pass," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "Sound travels strangely through narrow places like that." Karitha folded her arms. "You believe it wants us there." Ethan watched the giant silhouette across the water as it began moving once more, slow and deliberate, continuing downriver toward the distant stone corridor. "I think it knows something we do not." Karitha remained silent for several seconds. Valari hunters prided themselves on controlling the hunt, shaping the battlefield to their advantage. Yet here they stood, watching an ancient creature guide their movement through its territory with calm intelligence. Ethan finally turned away from the river and began walking downstream along the sand. His pace remained steady and unhurried. Karitha followed beside him, her thoughts unusually quiet. Ahead of them the river curved toward the narrowing cliffs of Echo Pass nearly half a mile away. Across the water the apex walker continued its silent journey toward the same destination, never rushing, never looking back, as if it already knew exactly where this strange hunt would end. Echo Pass rose ahead like a pair of ancient stone gates carved into the bones of the planet. The cliffs climbed nearly 300 feet into the gray sky, narrowing the river into a long corridor where the current quickened and the wind began to whisper between the rock walls. Ethan slowed as he stepped onto the first stretch of polished stone beside the water. The sound here was different. Every movement echoed softly, even the quiet scrape of his boots. Karitha noticed it as well. Her visor registered the acoustic distortion immediately. "The canyon amplifies sound by nearly 300%, she said quietly. Ethan nodded without looking back. "Exactly what I expected." They continued forward until the valley behind them disappeared completely, replaced by the tall, silent walls of Echo Pass. The river curved slightly to the left ahead, vanishing around a bend where sunlight cut down in long pale beams from the narrow sky above. That was where the apex walker waited. It stood in the center of the shallow river, the water flowing calmly around its immense legs. For the first time since the hunt began, the creature did not move. Ethan stopped about 60 yards away. The sound of the river filled the canyon like distant wind. Karitha studied the giant animal through her visor. Its posture had changed. The enormous head lowered slightly as it looked toward them, not in challenge, not in fear, in recognition. Ethan removed the bow from his shoulder and rested it gently against a smooth rock beside him. Karitha looked at him with surprise. "You are not taking the shot." Ethan shook his head slowly. This was never about the shot. The apex walker shifted its weight slightly, sending small ripples across the river's surface. Ethan stepped forward alone until he stood only 30 yards from the creature. The canyon carried every sound perfectly. When he spoke, his voice echoed softly along the stone walls. "You brought us here for a reason," he said calmly. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the massive creature turned its head toward the cliff wall behind it. Karitha followed the direction of its gaze and finally saw what had been hidden from view along the shaded bank. A much smaller shape stood partially behind a fallen section of rock. A young apex walker, barely half the height of the giant adult. Its movements were uncertain, its steps careful as it tried to navigate the shallow water near the stones. Caritha lowered her visor in silence. Ethan did not move for a long moment. Then he slowly stepped backward until he reached his bow again. Instead of lifting it, he secured it across his back and turned away from the river. Caritha watched him carefully. You are ending the hunt. Ethan nodded once. No, he said quietly. It ended when we understood it. The adult apex walker remained in the river, watching them leave through the narrow canyon corridor. As Ethan and Caritha walked back toward the open basin, the wind carried one final echo through the stone walls behind them. Not a roar, not a warning, just the deep, steady breath of a creature that had chosen trust instead of fear. Caritha glanced at Ethan as they reached the mouth of the canyon, where the valley opened again beneath the wide sky. Her voice carried a tone of quiet wonder. Among my people, a hunter who walks away from victory is considered foolish. Ethan smiled faintly as the wind moved through the tall grass ahead of them. Where I come from, he said softly. Sometimes walking away is the only way to prove you deserve to win.